What is evolution? When we're talking about Darwinian evolution, what is it that we really mean? I think a definition of evolution is important, because there are other things going on that even the expert seems to mix together, and things then don't make any sense, as you'll see in this video and hopefully in some of the later ones. I've tried to show that Darwin's work begins billions of years before he could have ever imagined with atomic speciation. In fact, it begins at the very beginning with the hydrogen atom, because itself is part of the atomic species, or the atomic Serengeti. It is the hydrogen that both creates this universe and creates all of the other atoms, simply as different spatial rearrangements of itself through fusion. It is a simple process, but it is layered and it gets complicated. But ultimately, life begins a hell of a lot earlier than Darwin could have possibly suspected. However, Darwin's evolution is all there is, other than gravity, because there are just two paths: the path of gravity and alienated gravity, as I will try and show you, or you may have already, if you've seen the earlier videos, you may already agree with me to a certain extent, because there is nothing else. You are either looking at the path of alienation or the path of pure gravity. Let me show you. This is a picture, it's not a very good one, but you can hopefully see what I mean. They're supposed to, these little dots everywhere, represent the galaxies, and this is meant to be a picture of the known universe, or at least a part of it. These are galaxies, each of them much probably bigger than the Milky Way. So if you imagine that one of these is the Milky Way, you can now imagine where the Sun is, where the Earth is. Remember, just going across this in terms of size, we're talking about millions of light years. So the scale is crazy. It makes no real sense, other than to say it's enormous. However, I just want to make a point, because I think it's important, because we get too full of ourselves. For a monkey that was in the trees only a blink of an eye ago, we seem to think that we may be on the precipice of knowing everything there is to know about the universe. Because if you follow some of the programs that people are making, there's some really crazy stuff: the size of the universe, the reason for the universe, does God exist, and all this nonsense, which may be questions that we are curious about, but before we even ask them, I think we should think about them. These are dumb questions. They really make no sense. Why do they not make sense? First of all, let's just have a look at the scale. But as I was saying, that perception, as I said, because it's a very subjective perception from a human mind, is almost certainly wrong. I have no idea. I don't want to even speculate what the objective universe might be like, because that means, can I think outside my own mind? And the answer is no, I can't, because I'm stuck with my mind. But the scale of this whole thing that we're talking about, or more importantly, the point I'm making here, is the scale of gravity, or the scale of the gravitational universe compared to alienated gravity. There is almost no comparison. If you were selling it in kilo terms, you would just simply give the Earth away. I mean, you couldn't even measure it. It's that small, because we only find alienated gravity in the real sense, as in complexed alienated gravity, right here on Earth and nowhere else. Because although everywhere else we have atoms and atomic speciation, they probably have not congregated any further, because, well, we don't know, is the answer. So the scale is incomprehensible between the ratio of pure gravity and alienated gravity. The point I was making earlier is that objectivity is impossible, because the human mind has not evolved for seeking the truth, or pursuing intellectual pursuits, or justice, or any other nonsense that we like to wear as jewelry and make ourselves feel good about ourselves. We're just basically very, very simple organic machines that have been programmed for maximum survivability. And we will, and we have, sacrifice everything else if that survivability is threatened. And this is actually quite important later when we look at societies and look at social architecture, because anybody who believes that humanity is noble as such is not really thinking. Because my point is that evolution and the study of evolution is not just confined to some kind of a story about the jungle. It affects our lives on a day-to-day basis, and that relationship is important. So there is no point, if you know what the life cycle of a lion is, if you don't understand how evolution applies to you and applies to your thinking and applies to your living. And of course, we never learned that at school or at university, because we just learned garbage to pass exams, and facts, and so on. But my point is this: if you look here, imagine, for the sake of argument, the picture may not be very good, I couldn't really find the right picture, but imagine here's a Mr. Philosopher ant, here's some other ants that he's trying to explain the universe to, and they're standing by accident on a keyboard of a computer. How does the ant and its students perceive the keyboard or the computer? If you were to try and explain to Mr. Ant here what the computer was, how would you go about it? How could he possibly understand it? My point is that the ant neither has the hardware nor the software to perceive the universe beyond its own little circle of existence, beyond its own subjectivity, and we are exactly the same. For us to believe that we may not be, because we're just more complex than the ant, and therefore we must have reached perfect complexity, is unfortunately, I think, we need to do a lot more reading, a lot more thinking, because this particular form of thinking is very Aristotelian, when in fact it's very deeply flawed. Aristotle thought that way. If you read one of his books, at the very beginning he says that we're nearly there to understand everything there is to know about nature. And when you put that in perspective of how much more we have learned since Aristotle's time, that's laughable. The way I think that we should be thinking objectively about the universe is Socratic, and that's a totally different mindset. And the Socratic mindset is that he knows enough to know that he knows absolutely nothing. In other words, the more he learns about nature, the more he learns about the laws of physics, and the more he learns about evolution, he realizes how much more there is to know and to learn, that eventually it becomes overwhelming, and you realize that it's almost impossible that you should be able to understand it. Anyway, I will not hazard a guess, but as I said, the proportion of alienated gravity compared to pure gravity in the universe is minute. But here's an interesting point in the evolution, as we're talking about, is the first jump in alienation is the motive of alienation. And that's actually very important, and I need to explain that to you, because before this motive of alienation, the alienation acquires its own motive. The motive is pure gravity, because here, as you can see, the hydrogen combined gravitationally to form a helium. That is an alienation stage that is become alienated, because that's not 4 hydrogen, that is a single hydrogen atom, even though it is made up of 4 hydrogens. If you remember, if you looked at the videos before, you'll know that the difference between alienation and gravity is that gravity is additive, alienation is not. It just becomes one every time. Every layer, as you add more and more to it, it becomes a single unit. Fusion is purely gravitational motive, but replication is not, and that's the point. Because here, I'm just put this, it is a little fragment of an RNA. I'm using it loosely as an example for Luca, the last universal common ancestor, which may have been there, so it may have been a strand of DNA, but when it actually acquired and he became fully functional as a replicator, that's when it acquired a motive of its own. Now, if you're really thinking about this so far, although it's a motive that it has acquired for itself, guess what? It is still gravitational, because it involves replication and polymerization, and that in itself is a gravitational thing. And this is very, very important for later on when we look at the evolution of higher organisms and even social architecture, that the two go side by side. We are gravitational creatures. In fact, we are creatures that survive between 2 gravitational fields. So true life is a very, very precarious event. It lies between 2 giant boulders that could squash it to pieces, and one boulder is the gravitational thing that wants to kill it, And the other one, gravitational field, is the polymerization, almost cancerous. It just wants to keep going. And that's why when you leave animals unchecked and there's enough food for them, they kill themselves because they just overgraze and die. But that's later. But in any case, the point I was making here is that in this particular instance, the replication is a motive that is specific to alienation. This jump is inconceivably unlikely. This is just a pure opinion of mine when I think about the events of how something that is purely inert, a bunch of molecules and compounds just lying there, suddenly could acquire and become so sophisticated that could replicate itself, I believe is almost miraculous. And you would need the scales that I've shown you to really accommodate this, this particular unlikely process. I am personally of this opinion that if I were not writing this, if I wasn't sitting here and looking at all of this stuff, and of course I am myself a product of this process, I would say it is impossible. If I was a betting man, I would bet on gravity every single time, and you couldn't lose. I mean, the ratios are incredible. Alien gravity has acquired its own motive in a universe of pure gravity. That was my point at this point, and this is of course part of evolution. I'm describing evolution, how it goes from purely gravitational evolution of atomic Serengeti, atomic speciation, into now a specific alienated gravity having its own motive, and therefore it can complex separately to pure gravity. So life is impossible, I think. Well, almost, because obviously we're here. But some believe it's easy. You're going to have to make up your own mind based on the evidence. Let me show you the evidence and let me explain what I mean. There are people, the primordial soup nonsense. I believe that experiment to be complete nonsense because the people who are doing it are purely applying a kind of a mathematical and statistical approach to reality without knowing, without really considering all of the complications. And it means this, that if we put basically the certain basic raw materials in a flask, and we heat them and pass sparks in them. You must have heard of this in school and various other places, and keep boiling it, and to mimic the very early Earth, if you like. We get and when they heated it and basically analyzed at the end of the reaction, what they got some amino acids, they got some complex organic compounds that are essential for making life, and they thought, oh, here we go, things could just evolve very easily and spontaneously, because guess what, it evolved. We know it evolved on Earth, so it must be easy. Unfortunately, that doesn't make any sense. Just because it evolved on Earth, it doesn't mean it can evolve everywhere else, and this experiment is fundamentally flawed. Why? Because of this. This is a dead guy. This could be you or me. A bullet in the head and we're dead, right? Now, this guy here, he's just died, and he is the most complex form of alienated gravity that we know of in the universe or on planet Earth, because, we are the most complex organisms based, again, I'll justify this later, because a lot of natural historians would argue, no, we're not special, we're just another event. That's nonsense, because there is something fundamentally different between us and other animals which represents another evolutionary jump. And basically it's a jump between irresistible selection, which are chemical pathways, to conscious selection. With us coming to being, DNA has jumped and now has eyes. I'm not talking about from the perspective of us, I'm talking about the perspective of DNA, the only perspective that matters. But again, that's something else. I'm jumping a bit far ahead. This thing is super complicated. It has all of the machinery, if you like, for replication. Every single cell is still intact. All of the basics are there. What would happen if you boil him or not boil him, or do whatever the hell you like to this, even if you Dr. Frankenstein? I mean, that can exist in in Hollywood movies, but no matter what you do to this man, you will get absolutely nothing. Zero, nada. He will just decompose and he will just disappear. Now, don't go on about the viruses and the bacteria that are contained within him, that's a completely different thing. I'm talking about the events that are made up and share his DNA only. That will simply collapse and disappear. And so the idea that life is easy, the idea that we could just get from some organic compounds and immediately get this complexation is a nonsense, because even when you start with a super complicated event, it does not work. It's a collapse, but I'll show you later what that collapse actually is. So Darwin's path is the only path. Why? Because I'm saying that evolution is the only path that we can think about in this universe, because there is nothing else. Why? Because, well, the other path is gravity. And what is the path of gravity? What is the evolution of gravity, if you like? Since almost everything is gravity, the evolution of gravity is a meaningless concept. Why? Because, look, if we have a nebula, and this nebula condenses, and eventually we get planets and stars, the star will undergo, if it's big enough, again, an expansion, and we get more nebulas, and on it goes. And basically, gravity is nothing but a boiling cauldron. It is fractal. It repeats itself over and over and over and over again, like a boiling, pan. So you can't actually call that evolution. What the hell do you mean by evolution? It's not going anywhere. It's the same thing. It's just you getting up and throwing yourself off a wall, climbing again, throwing yourself off the wall, on and on and on. You achieve nothing, and we cannot call that evolution. So when we're talking about Darwin and we're talking about evolution, we are talking about everything other than gravity, which is the only path, and that's the path of alienation. So evolution means the linear path of alienation, or the study or the following up of the linear path of evolution. And by that I actually mean that you yourself are an unbroken line from the very beginning of the universe to where you are now, and whatever happens after you is also part of that unbroken line. So here, as you know, I'll just recap: hydrogen atoms form hydrogen molecules, preferentially, by the way, that's important, and then they undergo fusion to give helium and other species of atoms, forming atomic Serengeti, and then they will then form what I would call molecular Serengeti, and then will go on to form cellular or compound Serengetis, etc., etc., etc. But that is what we mean by evolution, the study of the linear path of alienation. If you need a better explanation of it in one place, so that in some way it makes logical sense, I can only make these videos in short things, not to give you concrete answers, but to hopefully just excite you enough to think about these concepts, and maybe then to try and want to understand it a bit more. It's completely free as a Kindle ebook. I don't want anything for it, but it may help you, not because I have the right answer. I have the right answer for me, obviously, but you may be enticed or motivated to try and find the right answer. Who knows? Because again, as per Socrates, the unexamined life is not a human life, and unexamined truth are just opinions, pointless things that we learn and regurgitate for exams. And if we do not challenge establishment, they become just cults and capitalist organizations in which truths don't matter, and gradually everything falls apart. And if you look at the state of the world, I think you might agree with me that there's something seriously wrong with our education system. Otherwise, why, despite Cambridge and Oxford and every other bloody elitist organization that we have all around the world, we are making such a mess of it all? Anyway, thanks.